should work.
Okay.
Yeah. It's two dark people start snoozing. So, me included. We're ready, are we? Okay. I'm going to turn this on and clip it. Okay. Okay, good afternoon. Welcome to this week's ESS seminar. And, well, it's our first of the year, isn't it? And I'm pleased to welcome Bruce Jakosky, who's going to talk about, let me get this right, H2O and CO2 on Mars. He comes to us from the University of Colorado in Boulder. And, but you might see more of him because he's moving to Ballard soon. The movers are coming on Monday, apparently, back in Colorado. So Bruce did his PhD at Caltech, and he's been at University of Colorado since 1982. So, and since yesterday, it was 43 years. Did you say?
43.
43 years, and he's been involved with various space missions. With regard to Mars, it goes back all the way to the Viking mission to Mars, which launched in the 70s and continued through the 80s. But as well as that, Clementine for the Moon, Mars Observer, Mars Global Surveyor, Mars Odyssey, Mars Science Laboratory, but most recently, a mission called MAVEN, which I now can't remember what the acronym stands for exactly. Do you want to tell us?
See if you can make it up.
Mars, Atmosphere, and Volatile Evolution, something. What's the N again?
The N in MAVEN is the N at the end of evolution.
Evolution, yeah. Okay.
You have no idea the crap I took for that.
So he's been PI on that mission. Recently he stepped down and became deputy, is that right?
Just science team member.
Just science team member, okay, and handed over to somebody else. But it's still continuing looking at that data, and it's because of looking at that data and thinking about the evolution of Mars that he's going to talk about what he's going to talk about today. So take it away, Bruce.
So thank you, David. And thank you for inviting me to come and to be a visiting affiliate or whatever you call it within the department. I'm very much looking forward to being here. Is the volume good here? I'm hoping that I will survive long enough to move here. The movers are coming on Monday, and it's not clear that my wife won't kill me for being out of town for 3 days right before they arrive. What I want to do today, come on, that was supposed to be a laugh line. That's better, you'll learn. Thank you. What I want to do today is talk about not just MAVEN data, but about how it integrates with everything else we know about Mars and what we know about the history of water and CO2. For most people, the issues for Mars really have to do with whether there's any life there, what the climate has been through time. Has there ever been life? Is Mars habitable, whether there's life or not? And how has the climate evolved? And the reason I'll talk about water and CO2 is those are the two most significant climate-active gases that can be in the atmosphere. And of course, water can be not just in the atmosphere, but as possibly liquid on the surface, or in the subsurface, which is where it would be most relevant for whether life has been there. I want to start with the obvious, comparing Earth and Mars. Mars is the one on the right. I wasn't sure how far back to basics I had to go here, just in case I did label them. Mars is about half the diameter of the Earth. It's about 1.5 times as far from the sun as the Earth is, so it has a different thermal environment. If you look at the Earth, it has everything you think you need to be able to support life, liquid water, an atmosphere. You can't really see the atmosphere in this picture, but you can see all the clouds in the atmosphere, oceans, so there's lots of liquid water. You look at Mars, and it has an atmosphere, but it's only about 5% as thick as the Earth's atmosphere, and it's predominantly CO2. There you can see the ice and the polar cap at the bottom, so you know that there is at least water ice and CO2 ice. It's debatable whether there's any liquid water and the nature of any liquid water, but that's one of the questions. Today, Mars is a very cold and dry planet. The pressure is 6 millibars, so very small. The atmosphere is predominantly CO2, and if you look, I included things all the way down to water. It's 0.03%, and that pretty much saturates the atmosphere most of the time. The surface temperature varies between about 140 and 300 K. The 300 K takes people by surprise, but that's the temperature of the ground at noon at the equator during summer. So that's the hottest it gets. It can't get down to 140. The average temperature is around 220 K, so something like 50 K below the melting point of ice or the freezing point of water. So we would be surprised to find large deposits of liquid water. I want to go through some of the history that points toward liquid water and the evolution of habitability. But I want to start with the timeline I'm going to use, because this is common to all the upcoming charts. It shows the history of Mars from 4.5 billion years ago up to the present, so 4.5 billion years. And we've divided it up into different epochs based on the geological processes that are happening. The Amazonian, Hesperian, Noachian, and pre-Noachian. Noachian doesn't refer to the floods and Noah and his ark. It's the noxious region of Mars. So we're going to use this. Let's start at the relatively recent and work backwards. The Amazonian, the last 3 billion years or so. I was being cute, so I said I don't need a laser pointer. I can use this one in PowerPoint. I'm not sure I really can. I can look down here and see it too. The surface is cold and dry. It's a dusty, rocky place. You can see things that tell us about geological processes, but in this image at least, they all relate to impacts that would have produced the rocks, dust storms that would have created all the fine material, not much else. There are global dust storms every few Martian years. By the way, David, one thing you didn't mention was even though on Earth I'm coming up on 70, in Mars years I just turned 37. And I think that's a better way to keep track of it. But every few years there's a global dust storm, and we don't understand the cause. We see water. This is a graph of the seasonal water cycle where you see this large pulse of water coming into the atmosphere during northern hemisphere summer. It all comes off the polar caps and gets transported away. The polar caps are, summer polar cap in the northern hemisphere is water ice predominantly, and the water cycle and the dust cycle vary in response to the axial obliquity. The obliquity is the tilt of the polar axis with respect to the normal to the orbital plane. It's 25.2 degrees on Mars. If I say it's 23.5 degrees on Earth, most people then know what I mean. It drives the seasons. It drives lots of things. The obliquity varies on timescales of 10 to the 5 and 10 to the 6 years. So recently it's been as high as 35, as low as 15, and it wanders around. The guiding center can wander around, so we'll talk about some of the obliquity variations. All of these things relate to the present climate, which is too cold, too dry, no liquid water to support life. If we go back to the Hesperian, we see evidence for large catastrophic floods, outflow channels with water that appears to have debouched from the crust, blurped up to the surface and flowed out over the surface. There's also evidence for lakes inside of impact craters. This is Jezero Crater, where the Perseverance rover is tootling around. It once was filled with water. And then, of course, volcanism, which is operated through time. Volcanism brings magma up from melting within the mantle. It releases water, CO2, and other gases into the atmosphere. All of these things relate to water, and we see evidence that in the Hesperian there was more water, and it was more abundant than in the Amazonian. If we go to the Noachian, it gets more interesting because on the left you see what appear to be river drainage channels. It looks like runoff of water, and you see small channels going downstream and coalescing into larger channels, exactly like you would expect if water was relatively stable, relatively abundant, and in an environment that is warmer than today's and would allow water to exist in a significant way as liquid. Many of the impact craters are heavily degraded. You can see that in this one. This is, I'm eyeballing it about 30, 40 kilometers across, and it's been eroded, so you really don't see much of an ejecta blanket. You don't see a central peak. On the interior rim, you can see scalloping that looks like it was looks like the spur and gully type of topography you would expect if water was present and running off and eroding the surface. And then if you count up the number of craters, what you see is that about 4 billion years ago, something erased all of the craters smaller than about 15 kilometers. There was some major erosional event that, given the evidence for water, is usually attributed to water. So we see a lot of evidence that water, again, was more abundant, more stable, present as liquid, at least intermittently during the earlier phases. And if we go to the pre-Noachian, the boundary between Noachian and pre-Noachian is what can you see in the geological record. And the start of the Noachian really is as far back as you can see rocks and figure out what processes were operating. But in the Noachian, the pre-Noachian, we see evidence for minerals that require the presence of liquid water in order to form. This is a map coming out of some of the remote sensing measurements, and all of those dots represent different minerals, most of which require liquid water. Some of them may not have water, like the carbonates, which are the green, and you can see a few dots of green up in here, but they typically form most readily when there's liquid water. Some of these minerals formed into the Hesperian, so I drew a dashed line there, but most of it was in the Noachian. So with that in mind, one of the real puzzles on climate is how come temperatures were warmer 4 billion years ago than they are today. The sun at that time was 30% dimmer than it is today, so it appears that as the sun heated up, Mars cooled down. Where did the obvious solution is there must have been a greenhouse gas. CO2 is the obvious one. It produces a great greenhouse gas. We're demonstrating that on Earth today as we put more CO2 into the atmosphere. We're watching the temperatures on Earth warm up, and I think that's an incredibly valuable approach, and I'm impressed that everyone on Earth would band together to help us understand the Martian environment by doing this experiment. But the question is, if it was a greenhouse, where did the CO2 go? Where did the water go? And I started to list all the outstanding science questions we could put here to address. And I had a list of about a dozen, but I realized they all come down to where did the water go? Where did the CO2 go? So that's what I'm going to address for the rest of the talk. That's really the thrust of this discussion. And through this discussion, the hobby horse I've been riding, or the soapbox I've been standing on, is you can't just look at the atmosphere and understand it. The Mars environmental system is a complex, interconnected one that involves everything from the deep mantle to the crust, the surface, the polar caps, the lower atmosphere, the upper atmosphere, lost to space. All of these couple together. And if we want to think about the history of water or the history of CO2, we need to think about the coupling between these different areas and how it evolved through time. So keep this picture in mind throughout the whole discussion. We'll start with where did the water go. And I'm going to show you the bottom line here and then walk through some of the arguments. What I've been trying to do is to look at the observable sinks for water and see if we can quantify how much water went into each one. This is in contrast to developing these models of all the processes and just watching what happens. Models are a dime a dozen, and I've spent my dime and done my dozen models, but I've come around to, and they have a place to help us understand what processes can play a role, but I've come back to the idea that the fundamental issue is where did the water actually go, and then can we use that to help understand what processes have operated. So I've listed here the places that I think water has gone, that we can observe or infer, and the amounts of water are in a funny units. It's meters of water. GEL is global equivalent layer. If you took the water that went into each sink and spread it uniformly over the surface all at one time, how thick a layer would it be? And for example, the present-day exchangeable water is predominantly the polar caps. If you took the polar caps and spread that water ice uniformly, it would make a global layer about 20 to 30 meters deep. So that's the currency we're going to be talking about. The amount lost to space, and I'll walk through each of these, but I'll just mention them. Lost to space is between about 100 and 600 meters of water, incorporated into minerals up to a couple of hundred meters, potential buried ice in the northern lowlands that came from an early ocean, maybe 100 meters, and water that I will talk about that is inferred to be within the crust, maybe up to a kilometer. So let's walk through a couple of these. The first is lost to space, and we've been able to measure the amount lost to space. It's shown in the left-hand diagram as a function of Mars seasons. So this is 1 year, and the blue line here shows the amount of water as an escape rate as measured from the MAVEN spacecraft. This is a hard graph to follow, so instead, let's look at the one on the right. It's the amount of hydrogen in the upper atmosphere. All of that hydrogen eventually will escape to space, and we can look at that more easily. What it shows is that there's a factor of 10 variation in the escape rate of hydrogen, and it appears to coincide, the high hydrogen escape rate appears to coincide with the seasons where the atmosphere of the planet is dusty. And I'll come back to talk about that. The amount, the rate at which it's escaping is such that in 4.5 billion years, if you multiplied that out times the rate, it would be a few meters as a global equivalent layer. So that suggests it's negligible. That's not the full story. What we see is that the escape rate does connect up to the amount of dust in the atmosphere. This is the response of the atmosphere and upper atmosphere during a regional dust event where dust is raised into the atmosphere. The amount of dust in the atmosphere, this is shown as a function of latitude and days. So for about 3 months, this shows the regional dust storm, which occurs, what is that, in mid-January for about a week. In response, the dust in the atmosphere absorbs sunlight, it warms up, and you can see that in the second panel here, where the raising the dust coincides with higher temperatures. When the temperatures go up, the clouds disappear. This is a measure of equatorial belt of clouds, and you can see it's disappeared. When the temperatures go up, water vapor in the atmosphere can rise to higher altitudes. And you see that this is a plot now of the amount of water as a function of altitude and days, and it rises up to higher altitude, and then the amount of hydrogen in the upper atmosphere increases. So through this whole chain, you increase dust in the atmosphere, and it causes hydrogen to escape at a greater rate. So the hydrogen escape rate is tied not only to the amount of water in the atmosphere that can be photodissociated by sunlight, but to the amount of dust. You would think this would make it easy to extrapolate over long time periods. I jumped the gun. That's not till the next chart. The amount of hydrogen is thought to be correlated, coupled to the escape of oxygen. The chemical feedbacks are such that if oxygen doesn't escape, the amount that it builds up as hydrogen is released will cause recombination. So that feedback results in the hydrogen and oxygen loss rates being in the ratio of 2 to 1 over long time periods. And in essence, then, it is water that is escaping. We have measurements now from MAVEN and from other places of the oxygen and hydrogen loss rate. Oxygen on the bottom, hydrogen on the top, and I wasn't clever enough to use the same scale, so I had to offset one from the other. And you can see that the oxygen escape rate is close to half of the hydrogen escape rate. It doesn't necessarily match exactly because there are a lot of processes that operate on year, decade, century timescales, but on timescales of 10 to the 3 to 10 to the 5 years, we expect them to balance. On the left, by the way, are measurements of the oxygen escape. We're measuring it as it is leaving. The colors represent the amounts. The arrows represent the direction of movement. So you would think that since we know the escape rates, we could extrapolate. The problem is we don't really understand the behavior of dust or the behavior of water. The behavior of dust, this is a picture of one of the global dust storms. The problem there is that when telescopic observers who've been observing Mars for 100 years saw the 1956 dust storm, they had never seen anything like it. And it was a brand new phenomenon. That suggests that something is changing on the decades to centuries timescale. In addition, if you measure the radius of Mars, which is what they could do in the late 1800s and the 1900s, you get values that are lower than what was measured during the spacecraft era. When you're measuring the radius telescopically, you're measuring to an altitude where the line of sight opacity is 1. So it becomes a measure of how dusty the atmosphere is. This difference in the radius, I don't believe any one of these numbers, but if you average them all together, you get a credible number, and the average of all these is somewhere around here. It's about 20 kilometers below what spacecraft saw. That translates into a factor of 5 difference in the dust abundance. So from 1875 to 1958, the average dust abundance in the Mars atmosphere was 5 times lower than what Viking saw in the 1970s. That, again, says something about the behavior of dust on the century timescale, decades to centuries. The water cycle also varies. The water that we see in the atmosphere ultimately comes from water sublimated off the summertime North Polar Cap. It heats up, water goes into the atmosphere. But we see year-to-year variability. In this diagram, the histogram-looking thing are the global averages measured from Viking of how much water is in the atmosphere. And this big drop is when there was a dust storm. By the time you get out to here, the dust had dissipated and we're getting a reasonable number. But look, this value is down here. In 1969, they measured values up here. When they saw this, they said that mirrors this is when the southern cap is in summer, that mirrors when the northern cap was in summer. Clearly, both caps are water ice. That's not what Vikings saw. What happened in 1969? No idea. Could it be that all the CO2 covering the cap disappeared and exposed a water ice cap? Something funky with the dynamics of the atmosphere that would move water around? We don't know, but what I can say is we don't understand enough to explain a factor of 5 or 6 difference in the behavior of water. We don't know what behavior of the dust is typical. We don't know what behavior of the water is typical. That makes it hard to extrapolate over longer timescales. But wait, it gets worse, because this obliquity, this is the same diagram I showed earlier, the tilt of the polar axis, it varies on 10 to the 5th and 10 to the 6th year timescales, and it's chaotic. And that guiding center, the value that runs through the middle of all of these, wanders around between about 10 and 60 degrees on timescales of 10 million years and longer. So we don't know what the obliquity is. Even if we did, we don't know how that translates into how much water sublimates off the polar cap. These are different models of the summertime sublimation as a function of the tilt of the polar axis, and we just don't understand it. The obliquity we see today, 25 degrees, is lower than the obliquity 75% of the time, almost 80%. So we don't know the tilt of the polar axis. We don't know how the polar cap responds. We don't know what the dust is. We don't know what the water cycle is. So why do we think we can extrapolate the water behavior to other epochs? I think we can't. I think it's a difficult problem. We do know that at high obliquity, there's more water. That's a given. Okay, that's sort of one point. That's the current behavior over the last, say, 5 or 10 million years. What about longer timescales? Let's look at the Amazonian. I already talked about the loss of oxygen and its coupling to the loss of water and how that affects the polar caps. The loss of oxygen depends on the solar extreme ultraviolet photons coming from the sun, because that's what breaks up the water into hydrogen and oxygen. And this represents the history translated into the oxygen loss rate. It varies by a factor of 10. If you go back 3.5 billion years, the loss rate was 10 times greater. What that means is there must have been a lot more water at the surface 3.5 billion years ago than there is today. And we see geological evidence for that. This is a map, a geological map. The yellow here is something called the Dorsa Argentea Formation, and it's thought to be the remnants of an ancient, larger polar ice cap. It would have reflected a larger amount of water at the surface, and that water has disappeared. It's no longer there. So we have more water at the surface, a way to get rid of it through time to get to the low values we see today. It's a story that hangs together. With more water at the surface 3 billion years ago, and with the higher tilt of the polar axis, there would be more water in the atmosphere. What that does is it expands the region where ground ice is stable, and you'd get ice stable over the majority of the planet, much of the time. Mars may actually have been an ice ball planet 75, 80% of the time. You know, people talk about ice ball Earth. This is ice ball Mars. What about water deep within the crust? I mentioned that in passing. We have the catastrophic flood channels. I showed this one earlier. This is where it appears on the surface. The water burst forth from beneath the surface, flowed out into the northern lowlands. There are also features like this one. I like this one because it really shows clearly the fact that water must have burst up from beneath the surface. This scarp here is 20 kilometers wide, 2 kilometers high, and the water came out and flowed over the surface. It's located right here, same region. These released water from the crust. That means there must have been water within the crust. We don't know if there's any today. Did it release all the water? Probably not. It probably released about 10% of the crustal water, and the remaining 90% is sitting there still within the crust. We don't know if it's there. We don't have measurements. We also don't know if that interacts with the water at the surface in any way. Finally, we have hydrated minerals, and we looked at the abundance of these and tried to estimate geologically how much it represents. Our best estimate is up to a couple of hundred meters of water, no more than 500 meters global equivalent layer. Can we quantify this any better? We can use the ratio of D to H to tell us about water. The hydrogen escapes to space. The H escapes more readily than D because it's half the weight. and the water remaining behind gets enriched in deuterium. The D to H ratio of water on Mars is about 5 or 6 times that of water on Earth. So we think that's telling us about loss of water to space. Depending on what models you use, it means somewhere between about 85 and 95% of the water present at the surface has been lost to space. We know that the current surface layer has about 30 meters of water. That's predominantly the ice caps. And that means that there must have been up to 600 meters of water present at the surface, and all but 30 has escaped. So this gives us some quantitative estimate. This has been a lot of data. I've thrown a lot of things at you, but let me come back to this summary of how much water has gone into each of these sinks. Present-day exchangeable water of 20 to 30, water lost to space from the hydrogen from the D to H, water incorporated into minerals from mapping the minerals that contain water, ice from an early ocean. I haven't talked about that, but that's water that would have come out of the flood channels. All that adds up to about between 400 and 1,000 meters global equivalent layer of water. The next amount is inferred crustal water. If the outflow flood channels are indicative of there being more water in the crust, there could be up to 1 kilometer of water there. The bottom line with regard to water is we can account for at least about 1 kilometer of water at the surface, and maybe as much as 2 kilometers. This is clearly enough to have formed the geological features that are indicative of the presence of liquid water. And if you think about going back to the question about life, it's enough to have been relevant when it was mobilized, when it was liquid, to possible life. Again, I've thrown a bunch of things at you, a lot of data, but it all gives us a consistent picture that there was more water early on, that it's been lost to a number of sinks, and we can account for it, and we can understand how much is present at the surface. Let's go to the second topic, which has less data, so it's a lot easier to talk about, and that is, where did the CO2 go? And I'll do the same thing. I'm going to show you the bottom line here of where we can identify places that CO2 has gone and try to quantify how much it is, and I'll give you a couple of examples. The first line, impacts onto the planet, especially early in history, can splash water from the atmosphere off into space. Impact ejection, we think, is lost between 500 and 1,000 millibars. For CO2, we use the currency of millibars. How thick would the atmosphere be if all that gas was present at one time? For context, the current atmosphere has 6 millibars, which is equivalent to about 15 grams per square centimeter. 15 grams of CO2 overlying every square centimeter of surface. The amount lost to space by other processes, by photochemical processes, between 1,000 and 2,000 millibars. Some in the polar ice, some in polar clathrate. The other place people have talked about is carbonates. CO2 that gets taken out of the atmosphere and put into carbon-bearing minerals, things like calcite. Think of the White Cliffs of Dover, if you need an example, that are all carbonates. We know there's some in the near surface, there might be some in the deep surface, and I'll come back and talk about the total in a minute. So let me start with impact ejection. When the planet was forming, the large impacts would all splash water off, splash all atmosphere as gas. I guess I shouldn't use the word splash. That has connotations that I'm not intending here. When the protoplanet, when the planetesimal comes through the atmosphere, momentum is transferred to gas and it goes out. When it hits the planet, an ejecta comes out. The ejecta hits the gas molecules, transfers momentum, and it escapes. This is one model of how rapidly it would escape as a function of time. And if you go back to the time of the onset of the geological record up to the present, you can lose more than 50% of the gas just by this process. Carbonate minerals. This has been the holy grail of Mars science for decades because people thought the only place you could put gas is into carbonates. So we have to find that thick carbonate deposit that would show us where all the CO2 is buried. And if I remember right, 1 bar of CO2, 1,000 millibars, would form a layer of carbonates about 40 meters thick. So that's a lot of carbonates to hide. There's a small number of places where it's been identified at the surface. The global dust in the atmosphere contains carbonates. These contain about 10 or a few tens of millibars equivalent of CO2. But there could be CO2 buried deeply. We see it exposed in a few places, like where impact craters have dug out or where there's many kilometers of vertical scarp. You can see small amounts. If that represents a global layer of carbonate, there could be as much as a bar. If you only see it where it's exposed, it could be down around 10 millibars. Much as we used the D to H ratio to talk about how much water has been lost, we can use the ratio of carbon-13 to carbon-12 to say something about loss to space. This shows the ratio of C13 to 12 expressed as in delta terms. So 100 per mil here represents a 10% increase in the ratio of C13 to 12. This shows it as a function of the fraction of gas remaining. As you remove CO2 to space and a smaller fraction remains, the ratio of 13 to 12 goes up. If all you're doing is forming carbonates, it goes the other way because carbonates preferentially take the 13 out and it would go down. Let's look at the data. So this shows two values, the mantle represented by Mars meteorites, the most tightly bound carbon within the meteorites, and then the current atmosphere. If that represents an increase due to loss to space, that's about 60 or 70 per mil, 6 or 7%, and it would require a loss of about half of the CO2. But wait, it's worse than that, or better, depending on your perspective, because the Tharsis bulge represents a big pumping of volcanism at one particular time, and that would have partially reset the isotopes. So this is what I think it looked like prior to the Tharsis volcanism. And that amount of fractionation would require a loss of 2/3 of the atmosphere to space. If you require a couple of bars of atmosphere, a couple thousand millibars, in order to warm the planet to get that early liquid water, that means you've lost between about a half a bar and a bar of CO2. So again, to summarize, we've lost 500 to 1,000 millibars of CO2 ejected to space. I just said a different number, but stripped to space, 1 to 2 bars, 1,000 to 2,000 millibars. The polar ice today has about 6 millibars in it. There could be some clathrate, which is a CO2 water mixture, and the upper limit is about 30 millibars in terms of what you could fit into the ice that is present without violating thermal constraints. We have no measurement that says it's there, but this is the most that could be there. Near surface carbonates, that's the dust plus the places we see it exposed near the surface, 14 millibars. Adsorbed gas, a couple of tens, and that deep crustal carbonates may be as much as a bar. If you add it all up, you get between 1.5 to 3 bars of CO2 or more. And this is within the range of what people talk about as being required for the early greenhouse warming. So what we can do is account for a lot of the CO2 that would have produced that early greenhouse warming just by adding up the sinks. So this is a summary slide, but I'll warn you, it's not my last slide. I've got one more topic. Again, you've seen this chart. It shows the coupling between different areas. I think I've talked about that in terms of loss of water to the crust, release of water and CO2 to the atmosphere from volcanism, out of the mantle, etc. And if we're going to understand the history of volatiles, we need to look at all of these components. For CO2, the amounts of CO2 we can identify the sinks for are consistent with how much CO2 we think had to have been there early in history to warm the planet. For water, the amount of sinks we can identify for water add up to an amount that is consistent with what is required to form the morphology, to form the river channels, the lake beds, the erosion early on, etc. We have a consistent picture across supply and loss and morphology of the surface. And in that sense, I think that the last bullet here is an important one, that Mars, in terms of water and climate, Mars appears to meet all of the requirements necessary to support either an origin of life or the continued existence of life. And that leads into the last topic: is there life on Mars? Before I get into this, let me just take a quick poll, because everybody's interested, everybody pays a little attention. How many people think there's life on Mars? Currently. How about in the past? How many? Wow, what a positive group. How many think there isn't? As an aside, total aside, Mars is the only planet known, the only planet not just in the solar system, but in the galaxy and the universe, known to be populated entirely by robots. I just threw that out because there hasn't been enough laughter during this talk. So we have had several attempts to look for evidence for life. Viking, back in the 1970s, looked for evidence. We sent a lander to Mars to dig up samples and look to see what they could find. We did not send Carl Sagan, but he got a chance to pose with the lander out in the desert on Earth, not on Mars. There was an experiment that took samples and looked for three different approaches to metabolism to see if any of them showed evidence for liquid water. Excuse me, you get late in the talk and I start to misspeak, I apologize. They took samples, exposed them to different types of materials to see if any of them showed evidence for life. And it turned out all three did. All three showed positive, but then they did a control experiment where they heated the sample up to 140 degrees first. On Earth, that would kill the organisms. And two of them continued to show a positive result, so that's chemistry of some sort. The third one, the so-called labeled release experiment, that heating it up killed it. And to the day he died, the lead investigator on that believed he found evidence for life on Mars. The lack of organics was a problem, and most people today think that, not that there was no life, but that this experiment showed evidence of chemical processes and oxidants in the soil, not evidence of biological activity. But it was an incredibly valuable thing, set of experiments to go through to understand that. In hindsight, now that we understand things like life in extreme environments on Earth and the chemistry of life, in hindsight, it was an ill-guided experiment. On Earth, we can't culture more than one in, what was the number you said, I heard earlier today? More than 0.1 or 0.2% of organisms in the lab. How could we think we could take a scoop of soil, throw in a random mixture of organic molecules, and expect that the organisms would grow? It doesn't make sense. The second experiment was the Allen Hills meteorite, ALH 84001. We collect most of the meteorites in our collection now from Antarctica. You go out onto the ice, you find a rock. How did it get there? Most of them fell from the sky. This is one of the expeditions to collect it. They didn't take a picture of collecting Allen Hills meteorite, the 84001, but I wanted to show a picture. This is some random other meteorite. It was collected from the Allen Hills region, ALH, in the 1984 expedition. It happened to be the first rock they picked up that season. And within the sample, they found things that were interpreted initially as fossilized microbes. Other features were chemical disequilibrium in the rock that were argued can only be formed by biology, and magnetite grains in chains that could be formed by magnetotactic bacteria, analogous to magnetotactic bacteria on Earth. It took 5 years and 500 labs and analyses. Most people today think that these were not biological, that they were formed either as artifacts of the processing required to examine it, or by geological processes like hot water flowing through the rock, which is a very common occurrence here on Earth. So again, I don't think this says there wasn't life, but it argues that this doesn't tell us that there was. As an aside, when they picked up this rock, they picked it up out of a puddle, and there were demonstrably terrestrial organisms growing in it, in the outer reaches of it. So clearly it's been contaminated. Clearly picking up rocks out of puddles is not the way to look for evidence of Martian life. The third is the Curiosity rover. The SAM instrument, Surface and Atmosphere of Mars, has a mass spectrometer on it that is capable of looking for organics, and they found long-chain hydrocarbons that could be the decay products of organisms, could be formed in geological processes. These are up to 12 carbons long. I can't tell if they really think it's biology, but they're trying to hedge their bets. But the way it's being put forward is that this is not compelling evidence for life because it could be formed by non-biological processes as well. And then the last example I'm going to give was the recent press conference on possible biosignatures detected from the Perseverance rover. How many people watched this press conference? I see a handful. How many people read the paper? Wow, more people read the paper than watched the press conference. If you read the paper, you would have seen that they really hedged on what they were saying, and they gave it a fair, even-keeled treatment as to whether these are biology or geology. If you watch the press conference, you would have come away thinking, wow, it's biology, but they don't want to come out and say it. They hedge their bets. I'm not a geochemist. I'm not a chemist. I don't know how to interpret the results. I talked to one chemistry friend of mine. He says, we see this all the time on Earth, and they're non-biological. I called up Andrew Steele, who was a co-author who I've known for almost 40 years. And he says that if these were found on Earth with the evidence they saw, they would be interpreted as biological. But on Mars, there are enough things we don't know about the environment, about the history of these rocks, that it could be geological. So that's the uncertainty, and the only way that we're going to get a good answer out of this is to bring the samples back to Earth. Many of us are pushing hard to get the Mars sample return mission coming, because we want to bring them back. We'll see if that works. The next step in searching for life is sample return, because we really can't do enough, make enough measurements on the ground, on the surface, on Mars to answer the question. From Perseverance, we have some tantalizing hints of a few samples that may contain biological signatures or may not. In theory, we could always fly enough instruments, but some of the instruments are the size of this room, and on one spacecraft that may be half the size of this black square, black rectangle up on the front here, you can't put enough of them to do the analyses that would give you a definitive answer. So we have to bring it back. Now this one is my last chart, and I put this up here. It's a scene from the movie The Martian. How many of you have seen that movie? How many of you have seen it more than 3 times? More than 5? I see one more than 5. I put this up because the reason we want to go to Mars with people, the reason we want to bring samples back is not just that it would be cool, not just that we like exploring and we want to send people into space and have them do exciting things. It's to answer scientific questions. And the questions we're posing today about Mars center on issues like life. And we have the ability to bring samples back. We can do it with the Mars Sample Return mission. We can do it more effectively if we send people to do the in situ geological analysis. But by bringing samples back, we're going to address these fundamental science questions. If we choose not to do this, and if you follow the politics, we may be on the verge of never doing the Mars sample return, and who knows when or if we'll be able to do humans to Mars. If we choose not to do this, we're stepping back from answering the most important questions that we're asking about Mars, the questions that have plagued, that have puzzled people. Plague has its own connotation. I'm not talking about planetary protection today. We have the ability to answer questions that have puzzled people for a long time about whether there is any life elsewhere, and we have the ability to do it within our lifetimes, even within my lifetime. And I think we should not step back from that challenge. Mars is calling, and we must go. Thank you.
Okay, so we have time for questions. Who has some? Yes, Marjorie.
Sure, that's a great question. Thank you. And we've puzzled over this. And as an aside, that one chart where I showed that was in a paper that we published about a month ago in Icarus. So you can go read about it in more detail there, or if you want, I can send you a PDF. But the presence of ground ice it goes back to the idea by Leighton and Murray, if you're familiar with that paper and that idea, where the temperature of the subsurface is lower than the condensation temperature of the water in the atmosphere. Ice should diffuse from the atmosphere into the subsurface and freeze. That's telling us about most likely ice within the top 1 to 2 meters of the surface, where it's loose, unconsolidated regolith. Obviously, if you have something like the rock that is seen as bedrock outcrops in some places by the rovers, water isn't going to diffuse into it, not as vapor. That water would drive, now I'm getting out of my area of main expertise, but it would drive periglacial processes that should leave behind some morphological remnant. Things like desiccation cracks, freeze-thaw cracks, and sorry, I was just seeing the screen flicker up there. I was wondering if it was up here. But it would be things in the top meters of the surface. The last time the obliquity was high arguably may have been 5 million years ago. And it's not clear how things would have evolved in the last 5 million years, whether we would see things at the meter scale that would survive that long. Now, there are what are interpreted as patterned ground at the Viking 2 landing site, and ground ice is detected at the Phoenix landing site. Viking 2 was, I think, at 48 latitude, Phoenix at, I think, 78 latitude. So there's evidence for ground ice having been present. Would those features survive 5 million years? And I think the answer is, that's a technical term.
I think there are some relict polygons in the equatorial regions, which suggest, they were once there was once ice there. Not many, but there are some. Other questions? Yes.
Were the Mars epochs primarily determined by the climate and volatile history, or was it more mineralogy since
It's the geomorphology writ large. And the Noachian is dominated by impact cratering, and the impact cratering rate was tailing off. So that marks the end of the Noachian, and it corresponds to about 3.7 billion years ago by the current thinking. The Hesperian is marked by the behavior of the flood channels predominantly, and you don't see them earlier than about 3.7, you don't see them later than about 3, and then you don't see things that would produce obvious geological boundaries between 3 billion years ago and the present. So that marks the Amazonian, and it's thought to be something similar to today's environment, but as we've seen with modification due to obliquity variations or pressure variations. Yes?
I know you talked about how the domino effect with the dust storms, temperature, and all of that. Do you know exactly what causes the cycle of these dust storms and why they're not happening more or less frequently?
That's a really good question. And I should have mentioned this because we don't understand what causes dust storms. Nobody has a clue. They don't occur every Mars year. Global dust storms occur on average, like every 3 Mars years, but not in a consistent pattern. That means if we want to extrapolate to other epochs, we don't know how to do it. We don't know if we don't understand how it works today, how do you extrapolate to when you change the boundary conditions? That's why that's an important question.
Right at the back.
No evidence for plate tectonics. Keep in mind that there is evidence for tectonic activity, since tectonics just means movement. You can see places where there's faulting, where there's been movement. Most of it is associated either with the Tharsis bulge, which is a large equatorial bulge of stuff plopped down on the ground, and it presses down on the crust and creates this circumferential cracking that transitions to radial cracking, and Valles Marineris is perfectly aligned with one of those, the direction expected for one of those radial cracks. I think there's also some faulting in the polar regions that would be associated with changes in the shape of the planet.
But are you alluding to the magnetic field? Yeah. So you could talk to
okay.
Yeah.
You must know more than I do about his question.
Well, you talked about protecting the atmosphere, so that must mean
okay.
magnetic field.
Okay. Mars does not have a global magnetic field today, but it has regions of magnetized crust. And by mapping those regions, it appears the crust would have become magnetized when Mars did have a global field. And by mapping where these occur, it appears that Mars did have a global magnetic field prior to about 4.2 billion years ago, and then it disappeared. Initially, when we proposed the MAVEN mission, we thought that the turn-off of the magnetic field would correspond to turn-on of stripping by the solar wind. But it's got to be much more complicated than that, because when you look at the triad of terrestrial planets, Earth has a global magnetic field, Venus has no magnetic field, but a thick atmosphere. Mars has this dappled, spotty magnetic field and a thin atmosphere, yet the loss rate based on stripping by the solar wind of atoms out of all 3 planets is within an order of magnitude of each other. So it's got to be a complex behavior of the magnetic field related to stripping of the atmosphere.
You said you thought maybe only 10% of the liquid water is represented by the large outburst channels, and that perhaps 90% of that water still exists in the crust. In what form do you think it exists, and how do you make that estimate?
There's a couple of questions in there. The estimate goes back to Michael Carr's work in the late 70s based on Viking. He looked at where all those flood channels were, and I showed a map, an image that had essentially all of them on it, and drew a circle around it and said that appears to have drained water from beneath about 10% of the crust. He surmised, with no evidence, that the other 90% of the crust must have had a similar amount of water contained therein. If you do the math, he said that the outflow channels, in order to be carved, would have had the equivalent of about 35 meters global equivalent layer of water. And therefore, the remaining crust would have to have had at least 9 times that still there. So that's about, 350 meters. So that represents, in some sense, a minimum number. 1 to 2 kilometers is a maximum number just based on how much pore space there is that could be filled with water. The water could be present as liquid or as ice, depending on what the geothermal gradient is. Water could be in the crust down to a depth of about 20 kilometers. At that depth, flow of regolith grains, rock, is rapid enough that it would close off the pores. So it's down to 20 kilometers that you could contain water. Is there water there? We can speculate that there should be water there. We don't have a measurement that says there is or there isn't. There was one published last year by Wright and colleagues where they looked at the seismic properties of the crust and compared it to a model of what it would look like, what they would look like if you had water versus didn't have water, depending on what fraction of the pore space was filled, the size and shape of the pores, and they concluded that there must be water. But when you look at their models, all of their models from 0 water to 100% water matched the data. So higher probability for lots of water, but it didn't discriminate against no water so strongly that it was a viable conclusion. That's the first comment I've ever submitted on a paper in almost 50 years now. And that was published in, both of them were in Proceedings of NAS. We don't have a measurement. That's a very promising way to look for it, but we don't have the precision and accuracy yet.
Okay, Jody's bursting to ask a question. Yeah.
So it's kind of a historical question. So it seems like, the existence of water and a lot of water on Mars is now like plate tectonics, completely accepted. But I'm old enough to remember when there were big arguments about that. So what do you think changed? What changed so that everybody now, nobody argues that there wasn't all this water on Mars. Like, was it the geomorphology or just that the people who thought that died? Or what?
See, I was going to say that. I thought it would be tacky. Present company accepted, of course. I think there's a bunch of arguments. One is that only on the older surfaces do you see the evidence for liquid water. You see the valley networks that are thought to have been runoff channels. You see the outflow channels that don't say anything about stability of water, but they debouched a lot of water to the surface. You see minerals now that require the presence of liquid water to form. On top of that, you see evidence for loss of gas to space. And I talked about the D to H ratio and carbon 13 to 12 ratio. Both of them say pretty convincingly that gas has been lost to space. But you also see that in the N15-14 ratio, in the argon 38-36 ratio, across all of the light stable isotope pairs.
And you made all those cases. It's just like how 40 years ago could people argue against it? Is it just accumulated data, or it's just that people were blind to certain pieces of evidence?
I think when we first went to Mars, and Mariner 4 went by, and Mariner 6 and 7 went by, and the images showed they were all, because of the geometry, images of the heavily cratered southern terrain. It looked like the moon. It was interpreted as similar to the moon. And it wasn't until Mariner 9, then Viking, that we started to see the water-related features. And I think pointing to water, people do that way too often, way too quickly. And I think there's a knee-jerk reaction of, don't give me that bullshit, it's got to be something simpler than that. You just want there to be water because you want there to be life. And eventually the weight of the argument convinced people. I think people like Vic Baker, who made a compelling argument for liquid water in the flood channels, really impacted that as an example. And the models by Jim Pollack and Jim Casting of greenhouse that would produce a warm enough planet, and the models that are still going on, produce a warm enough planet to have liquid water. I think that the weight of evidence and time to get used to it.
Okay, a last one. What, did you say theological? Philosophical.
So I just want to react to your last slide. Marcus Goldman go. Isn't that a contradiction with the statement you were just making just before, which is the motivation to go is to answer these scientific questions like if life was ever present on Mars. As soon as you send humans, you're going to have a major planetary protection issue. And maybe we're actually going to erase all possible signs that existed prior. So what are your thoughts on this? Do you want to comment?
That's a good question, and I don't have a glib answer. It's one of these things where, yes, but, and I've come to the view that answering a question about life on Mars is really difficult. You know, people are trying to do it on exoplanets. They're talking about life on Venus. Even where we have samples, where we have rocks in our laboratory that have come from Mars, the 300 Martian meteorites, even where we've been able to do serious analysis on the surface, we don't have an answer. And I think it's come to the point that to answer that question is going to require people on the surface interpreting the geology and being able to look at this rock from all sides. I'm not pointing at your head when I talk about a rock. Be able to be able to look at this rock from all sides and go, no, that's not the one. This is the one we need to examine. I think it's going to require that to get a definitive answer. If we can get it from a robotic mission, I think that's going to be a real driver for human missions. And I think we know how to handle the planetary protection issues. It's not trivial, but it's doable. You know, we work with microbes that are fatal to humans 80–90% of the time, and we do it safely by working in BSL-4, or whatever it's called now, laboratories that prevent contamination. We know how to do that. We know how to protect the samples. We know how to protect the people. So I think it's a solvable problem. That doesn't mean I know the solution today, and I don't think anybody does, but it's solvable, and with some effort, we can solve it and get around it.
So on that optimistic note, let's thank Bruce again.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, I should have used my favorite tagline here, and that is, people propose lots of things, and that's absolutely the right way to do it. Think about what could it be. They proposed water, they proposed wind, carving by lava flowing over the surface. There was a paper by Yuck Young proposing photochemically produced hydrocarbons, glibly called Wesson oil, flowing over the surface. But there's a very technical reason why I think water is the best explanation. And if you look at these features, they look like they were caused by water.
I'm a sedimentary geologist, so you don't have to convince me. It just like was interesting that, you know, I mean, it's like,
Well, I mean,
I wonder if Conway did Conway do
but
this
there
right
are.
without
Well, no, I don't think. I think Conway thought it was more complex. Like there are some channels where lava has flowed down.
Yeah.
And there are some
lost the name of these things that look like the inverted hollow plug. Yardanes, thank you.
Wes Ford is a graduate of ours.
I knew him. And I used to remember the word.
Yeah,
We see evidence
yeah.
for wind. We see evidence for lava. But and not everything has to have the same mechanism.
Right.
But for most of these things, I think water is far and away the best. Oh, I've also heard liquid CO2, liquid SO2.
Really doesn't work. Because you need like 5 bar.
5 bar.
Pressure to
Yeah.
make it liquid, isn't it?
Oh, yeah, 5 bars. You can account for most of it. You can do it. No. No. And I like what Conway does because he was saying, let's look at all of the possibilities. Convince me. And I think everyone's become convinced. It didn't stick. It didn't come back till the late 90s.
Yeah, then it comes back.
Still hanging around.
It's another effect.
I don't.
Thank you, thank you.
Thank
Look
you.
forward to having you as a colleague.
I'm really looking forward to being around. We just have to move.
Yeah.
It's
really good to
talk.
But I do read a lot of science. I was kind of curious. Some of what you talked about today, I see echoes of in some of my favorite writers. Have you ever had any conversations with them, or they just kind of like read your
Not
stuff?
really. I'm impressed you didn't think my stuff belongs in that category.
No, actually, no. Well, the discussion like about the fissures and water, I mean, for us, kind of outburst floods, like I don't think I've ever really emphasized it because a lot of people don't really aware of that. But I've definitely seen that activity when what was it, City Robinson or Goodlow or somebody like that.
I wouldn't be surprised. Robinson's work is very scientifically
Yeah,
skilled.
Robinson's one of my favorites. I was just curious because a lot of the sci-fi I read have gotten into science things, but
I've talked to a few of them, but very cursorily.
yeah, like I said, the science was I was curious. Pretty good.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was great. You present really in a way that's really easy to understand. So,
I was worried that I was going too fast and way too many talks.
a lot of material, but it's good. So, are you ran the department?
Yeah. David and Vicki Netter helped me get
trying to check it throughout the